Hello and welcome everyone to our Mosaic Medical podcast. I'm joined by Jessica Fonteneau. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Fonteneau.
Fonteneau. It's a French name, isn't it?
It is.
I should have checked that first. Lovely to have you on, Jess. So for a little bit of context for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Camilla Stokholm. I'm the newest doctor at Mosaic Medical. And we're starting a podcast just to have some more conversations about new themes that perhaps patients and the wider public might not know about. Because from my point of view, I keep talking about the fact that I think medicine's going through an amazing metamorphosis and is changing in so many ways that actually a lot of people don't know about. And I'm really keen to spread the word. So I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you, Jess. You're our in-house nutritional therapist, and we're going to spend today talking about some special genetic testing you can have done to understand your personalised nutrition.
Thank you for having me, Camilla.
So to start off with, Jess, I usually just like to check in and learn a little bit more about my guests. So would you be able to explain a little bit about your background, your career, and how you personally became interested in nutrigenomic testing?
Long story. So trained as a nutritional therapist. I'm a member of BANT, qualified 12 years ago. And I got into it because I've suffered with eczema since I was 6 months old. And I really saw a specialist who opened up my eyes about nutrition and my skin and made me want to retrain and support others who were like me and that were brushed off from that kind of information. How did I get into nutrigenomic testing? Well, basically, I'm a bit of a nerd. So I love data and I love getting into the detail and I love finding out the why. To be honest, mostly for myself, but then to be able to share that and say, actually, this was transformative for a lot of people. If you know this information, if you know that something is maybe slowing down or speeding up something in your system, that can really help you decide, because I think that nutrition particularly is a decision each meal. It's not a prescription. It's not a you have to have, but it's a decision with each meal. I know what this is doing to me or could do to me. I will decide yes or no, because I love having that sense of choice and control. So Nutrigenomics, BANT has supported Nutrigenomics for a long time and has had a Nutrigenomics register since the laws were put in place about Nutrigenomics. And I was very keen to do the training. I trained through a fantastic company called LifeCode GX, and they're the genetic nutrigenomic tests that we use with Mosaic Medical patients.
I love the way you describe that eating and every meal is ultimately a decision, but in medicine we talk about giving patients an informed decision, and you have to give them all the information before they decide, for example, whether they're going to start a medication or if they're willing to have an operation. They need to know what the risks and benefits are. And what I love about personalised medicine and personalised nutrition specifically is ultimately you're empowering the individual, aren't you? You're kind of telling them, look, this is your kind of genetic recipe in a way. Let's make sure you're cooking it in the right way for you.
Absolutely. It's exactly that. And it's also being aware that just because you have all the genes that might say something, it doesn't mean that they're automatically going to express themselves or be switched on or manifest. So, for example, I'll give you a really simple example. If you look at my genes, I've got a real propensity for high blood pressure. They're all there. It's scattered, boom, 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 high blood pressure, high blood pressure. I've actually always had low blood pressure. And that's because of the way I was brought up by my French mum and the way we ate. The awareness that I need about that is now I'm moving into a slightly older chapter of my life. The risk of having higher blood pressure and having cardiovascular problems rises. So I have that knowledge that I do have that propensity, that possibility that I could easily go down that pathway. So I just need to take extra care that I'm supporting those pathways so they aren't being expressed.
And similarly for me, I know that I have a very high risk of developing type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance in general. When I learned that fact, it completely shocked me and my entire family, because I'm not I'm not genetically related to anyone who's ever had type 2 diabetes. And it just goes to show, again, these genes, they're not written in stone. They're really a recipe, but you're the cook. Your lifestyle is the cook, and you decide how you use that information. So it's never going to be bad news ultimately, because you do have some sway in how it all ends up affecting your health in the long run.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about Nutrigenomics in particular, because we're looking at the genes that are modifiable, or the SNPs on the genes that are modifiable by nutrition and lifestyle. We're not looking at the genes that can't be changed. We're looking at the ones that we can do something to support.
And just if we go backwards, because I'm conscious we're just assuming that everyone listening in knows precisely what nutrigenomics means, when actually, having worked as a GP previously, I'd never heard of any of this. I knew that as a GP, I could theoretically refer a patient to maybe have some kind of specialist genetic input, and they might have a test for a rare genetic disease. That was kind of the limit of my knowledge. And I also knew, having been given, my sister gave me a Christmas present to have my genes tested and look at my ancestry and some other subtle tests. So I knew that was possible. But the idea that you could do any kind of personalized genetic testing that could inform you how you could ultimately understand your health in the context of your diet and your own lifestyle, I just never knew that was a thing. So if we go backwards, could you tell us how do patients actually take the test? Like, what's practically involved? What does the test do, and why is it important?
My goodness. So, first question, what do we practically do to do the test? Is just like you see in the movies, on a crime show, you receive a swab and you rub it against the inside of your cheek for a few seconds, well specified in the test kit. And what you're doing is you're getting some of your skin DNA sample from the inside of your cheek, and then you pop it into a sealed package, an envelope, and send it back to the testing company. And that one swab can do multiple reports if they're ordered in one go. And Life CoGX, which is the company we work with, have multiple reports. So there's the nutrient core, which gives a snapshot and some very foundational SNPs that are important to know. Things like, have you got a genetic predisposition to be lactose intolerant or tolerant? Celiac disease, do you have a genetic predisposition for that? How your vitamin D receptors or transporters, are they a bit sluggish? Do they need a little bit extra vitamin D than most people? Do you need to top up more? Then there are other reports, such as a hormones report, which we use quite extensively in the Mosaic Medical breast cancer service with Dr. Amy Walker, that show your pathways of your steroid hormones and a little snapshot also of your stress hormones. There's the metabolics report, which is one of the reports I use the most, which shows how you metabolize fats or sugars, how you pick up whether you're in a fast or fed state, so that you can have some genes that keep you thinking that you are still hungry even though you've eaten enough. And quite a few of us have those genes, and how can we compensate against it? But also your cholesterol and bile pathways. Then there are reports such as detoxification. So, in our world today, there are quite a lot of things that we need to detoxify just because we're out and about. So how well are those pathways supported? Nervous system report. Are we somebody that gets our adrenaline a little bit fired up and that can't switch off? That report shows that and other information. I find that the important thing is to know what a Mosaic patient has come in for, and then what their symptoms are, what they're asking for support for, and then judge which of the reports will give them the most information that's appropriate to them. Because as we spoke about a minute ago, knowing everything is lovely. And I've got quite a few of the reports because, as I said, I'm a data nerd and I love knowing it. But we're not going to express all of those. So concentrating on the information that is actually affecting you now and that can be actionable and that can support you in your daily life to feel better, then those are the ones that are really important, making those choices.
The one that I'm most excited about from the list that you just gave is actually the only one I haven't had done, which is, I think you called it the metabolic one. And
Yeah.
I would love to understand whether my body processes carbohydrates well or not, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and oversimplification about what people should eat. And there are a lot of loud voices on the internet demanding that everyone should follow this diet or that one, when actually it's completely impossible to give everyone the exact same advice because of these genetic variations. There are some people who are going to respond really well and cope more with a higher carbohydrate diet or, for example, a higher fat diet than someone else would. And you really need to be able to tailor the advice to the individual. And in an ideal world, everyone would have the test done. But that's the one that I would be really, really interested in. And I know you've had your own done, haven't you? And that's changed the way you eat.
I have had my own done. It wasn't all good news. I wish it was. I wrote on my little interpretation of my fat metabolism page, keto, not good for me. I can tolerate some fats. I can't tolerate a lot. And, that's something, because my report also says that I'm not very good with carbs. So in terms of the interpretation of the global understanding of my report, a Mediterranean diet, lower carbs, not too many fats, just the right fats, plenty of good protein is the best way to eat for me. So I have known from experience, because I've gone through phases where I wanted to be more plant-based. It was important for me morally, but it's not something that actually suits my physiology or genetics at all. And I've always struggled with that. And getting this report really showed me why.
Yeah, it really gives you a lot of light bulb moments, I think. And I definitely had that myself. For context, I have spoken to Dr. Amy Walker about this on Instagram before, but for anyone listening in who doesn't know, I started out with Mosaic as a patient, actually. And then it was through that experience that I was so blown away by my experience that I then asked to come work with you. And the reason I joined was for an unusual reason. I was actually being proactive about my health because I have a very strong family history of breast cancer. And I met Dr. Amy Walker, who specializes in breast cancer. She mostly works with women who've already had breast cancer, but can also work with those of us who we know we're at risk of it and we want to do everything we can to prevent it. So the first thing we did was a number of different genetic tests and worked out, okay, where are my vulnerabilities? And just like you mentioned, some of the things we picked up were related to vitamin D, which is really relevant for breast cancer. I now know that I'm genetically just not great at both absorbing and using my vitamin D, and I need to aim for a different target range than maybe other people who are genetically better at it. I also know that I'm genetically useless at absorbing vitamin B12, which is very helpful for me to know, because that has a knock-on effect on so many other aspects of your health that I think most people just don't even realize. And it's made such a difference for me to know those things. And also, surprisingly, as well as being more at risk of developing insulin resistance, something I'm really fascinated by is the science of appetite. And it blew my mind to realize that I had not just one, but two obesity genes that completely alter my experience of appetite, meaning I'm more likely to feel hungry and less full than maybe someone who doesn't have those genes. And that's not necessarily bad news. It was just really empowering for me to have that information, and really relevant for breast cancer specifically. I know you work alongside Dr. Amy Walker with some of the breast cancer patients. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more about how you use the Nutrigenomic testing?
Yeah, so Dr. Walker does a lot of Nutrigenomic testing within the breast cancer service, and then I help interpret that because I have the Nutrigenomics training so that it's applicable in the nutrition recommendations that I give. And the reports that I think are the most useful in terms of a breast cancer diagnosis or wanting to reduce risk of having breast cancer initially or risk of recurrence are the Nutrient Core report, because they show things like your vitamin D status that I mentioned right at the very beginning, which is incredibly important for breast cancer. And we have very set levels that are suggested within the medical community, but we know that if we're not absorbing it or transporting it or metabolizing it in the right way, then we might need a little bit more than the average, because it's there, but we're not using it as we should be. We need more to be able to use it. Other reports that we find really critical almost in terms of breast cancer service is the methylation report. And methylation means very little to most people, including me
I've had it done. I've had the test done and I still find it confusing. So please enlighten me.
I'm going to just skim it. But basically, methylation is an absolutely crucial biochemical process, which involves the transfer of methyl groups to various molecules, basically allowing them to happen. And it's involved in gene expression, detoxification, neurotransmitter synthesis, so mood, and overall metabolic function. So basically, everything else happens because methylation happens. And Dr. Walker, who I know you spoke to about your Nutrigenomic report, she gives lovely descriptions about Velcro balls. I'm not very good at all of that, but she is very descriptive about it. But we have cycles that we have to pass through in order for this methylation process to work well. And each of those cycles can have their own slowness or fastness, speed of those pathways that we either want to support to slow down a bit because it's going too fast and will cause a bottleneck in terms of hormones, estrogen, detoxification, for example, if we're talking in terms of the breast cancer service, but also hormones, perimenopausal, menopausal women. I mean, hormones affect so many of us.
So I suppose you could say, come back to this analogy of your genes being like the recipe. I suppose methylation is almost about how your body reads the recipe. So it can read it very quickly, it can read it very slowly, it can maybe misunderstand certain bits, and it means that the instructions are being altered slightly, I suppose. Is that a bad analogy? I'm not sure.
Maybe. I think it's also it's more about the ingredients. So you've got all of the ingredients, but in some places you may have too many. So you might have too much salt that will ruin the rest of not the rest, I'm exaggerating, but that will have an impact on the rest. Or maybe you don't have enough ingredients. So B12, that we have a gene it's monitored called the FUT2. And you're either a secretor or you're a non-secretor. It's as black and white as that. And it's one of those genes where in one circumstance, it's great. If you've got the FUT2 gene in one circumstance, it means you have a greater chance of having a lovely broad variety of microbiome, multiple species. But on the other side, you have that same gene. It's not so positive because it means that you're a little bit less good at absorbing B12.
And that's me, actually. Anyway, I've got that gene. So I'm hoping that means I've got a really lovely, I know I've got a healthy and diverse gut microbiome. Some of that might be genetic. I like to think that a lot of it's because of what I eat. But at the same time, it kind of gives with one hand and takes with another. You get this nice microbiome, but then you have to give up some of your B12 absorption.
Absolutely. And so I would say, going back to that recipe analogy, that's the ingredient. And if you don't have that ingredient, then the next step in your method isn't going to work because you haven't put that ingredient in. And that's how I see methylation. We need all the right proportion ingredients. We need to not turn up the heat too fast on one because then it will burn it before it's absorbed. We could go for hours on this analogy, but yeah.
I think it's actually quite a good analogy. I don't know if Dr. Amy Walker would approve because I know she likes to talk about Lego, but I'm going to convince her this is a better one. Okay, so I'm going to
come up with my own.
But I think people can understand that okay, you're given these genes, that's the recipe, but then actually how you methylate those genes is decided by kind of the quality and the amount of the ingredients. But the good news is, and this is what I think people don't realize, we can manipulate the outcome. Because actually you could go to that cook and say, tomatoes you have, they're not the best quality. Why don't we give you some better quality tomatoes to overcome this recipe that you're using? And then the end result will actually be better.
Exactly. It's about giving the tools and the knowledge so that you can say, I have this pathway that's a little bit slow or a little bit fast, and this is what I need to do to help it.
And what would be some examples of some of the interventions we might use to compensate for a methylation process that maybe is sluggish, for example? Are there specific treatments you can use?
So one of the ones that we often see is that the second cycle, they're all interlinked. So I'm just calling it the second cycle, is the methionine cycle. And the methionine cycle has the long route round, but it also has a shortcut. So if you've got a snip or two on your long route round, you can kind of say to yourself, I can lean in on the shortcut. But often we have a little bit of a sluggishness on both. And the shortcut route, some of the nutrients that are most useful for it are choline from eggs and things like betaine, like beetroot. So you can say, okay, well, I'm really sluggish on that shortcut. I'm going to do what I can to help the long route round, but every day or, every second day or as part of my diet weekly, I'm going to make sure I have the decent number of eggs and going to have some beetroot and some kiwi and some other things that really support that shortcut route.
No, now it's all coming back to me now, my conversation with Dr. Amy, because now that you mentioned that, she did specifically tell me you have to compensate and get enough choline in your diet. And Camilla, please eat some more beetroot. And then there were other things as well. I find it so interesting that you comment on food. And I love that because actually we're always more interested in a food first approach. And that's so empowering for patients to know that they're not just being expected to pop loads of fancy, incredibly expensive supplements. Eggs and beetroot are really humble ingredients that could still be making a big difference for that methylation process.
Absolutely. As a nutritional therapist, I'm very much a food first approach. I think that we should be able to nourish ourselves from our plates. Sometimes, supplements can be incredibly important and appropriate at certain times in our journey. But, if we can get as many of those nutrients bit by bit into a person's diet that can support their health long term, because it's a sustainability of the approach. It's not just saying, oh, well, this is for just this amount of time while you're working with us. These are changes that will be supportive for the whole of the rest of the life. Because one of the things that we didn't say right at the beginning about Nutrigenomics is that it's for life. You can do this test on a day-old baby. You can do it when you're 99. Your genetics don't change. So this information is useful via every life stage.
I know that's actually such a brilliant point to make. And it's never going to be too late as well, because that's the other point that I think a lot of people don't realise and might feel disheartened by. If you were to hear some bad news, so in my case, learning that I had 2 obesity genes could be really disheartening. But actually, I recognise that because of epigenetics, which is the relationship between our environment and our genes, you need to switch those genes on for them to actually start having an effect. And with obesity genes, you can actually think of them as a sort of dimmer switch. So there are things in your life that can slowly dial them up. And then that means, in my case, my appetite might go up and my sense of fullness, because of that leptin hormone, our fullness hormone, that might go down. But at the same time, there are still things that are within my power that I can do to dial it back down, so I actually have a much more controlled appetite. And simply knowing that I have those genes has been really, in a way, a weird relief, because it's helped me to understand myself and my experience, and means that I feel like I can do something about it. And I think that's going to be so powerful for people listening in, even knowing that that's a possibility.
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about the breast cancer service, but these tests are really useful for all kinds of populations. So, cardiovascular, metabolic health populations, that metabolics report is invaluable because it also has inflammatory markers. So there's so much information. You can turn around and say, well, I try to follow this diet and I've tried to follow so-and-so on Instagram or whatever, and it worked for my neighbor and my neighbor's friend, but it doesn't work for me. And these reports can give you that aha moment. This is why it doesn't work for me. All the will in the world, this is not going to work for me, but this is what will work for me. So I'm going to lean into that and do that, and I'm going to feel hopefully better and be able to sustain that way of eating and living because I feel great on it. And isn't that what we all want? to eat the way that makes ourselves feel great, not just following a pattern that people are saying, well, this is what everybody else is doing.
When you were saying that, I was thinking ultimately information is power when it comes to your own health. Almost more importantly, I think it really helps us to feel more compassion, not just for ourselves, but for other people. Because I think we've massively dumbed down nutrition in just on the internet and everywhere. Anyone can be an authority figure if they're an influencer, for example, or a fitfluencer. Just because of the shape of their body, they might imply that they have all the right answers, but actually they might just have certain Nutrigenomic tests that mean that compared to someone else, there are things about achieving that body that will be easier for them, or maybe they've just stumbled across a way of eating that works for them. And if you point out, actually, no, you're doing that, but for this other individual, because they have insulin resistance or carbohydrates massively impact that insulin resistance in their fat storing pathways, or they've got an altered appetite, their whole experience is going to be completely different from yours. So you can't compare two individuals. And I really, that's one of the main messages that I want to get across to people, that we still have so much unnecessary stigma around overweight and obesity, but we have the information to empower people to get rid of that stigma now. And it's just taking such a long time to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've agreed with everything you said. We aren't all the same. I qualified as a nutritional therapist. I put in a lot of really lovely, healthy fats into my diet. My metabolics report basically says, ooh, too many fats are not good for you. And, I thought I was doing everything right, but I can't. I'm a bit sensitive, so I still have the healthy fats, but I'm much more cautious about the portion sizes of them. So they're there, they're still supporting my aims, but too many are not good for me and don't suit me.
And so just on those other groups of people who would really benefit, I imagine someone who has a strong family history, for example, of heart disease, or someone who they're worried about their cholesterol levels and are worried about other related diseases like stroke and even maybe a family history of dementia, they would be good candidates for some of this nutrigenomic testing so that they can understand the right diet for them.
Absolutely. And as I said earlier, we would decide which nutrigenomics testing is the most appropriate for each person, because there are multiples. I gave a few of the reports. I didn't give them all. There's a histamine report, for example. So if you're somebody who really struggles with histamine or atopy, hay fever, etc., mast cell activation syndrome, then you can really have a look at how you metabolize your histamine and how you clear it. And that might explain. It doesn't always explain, but sometimes you can really see. But that's why I've always got too much. I don't have to be on a low histamine diet for centuries, which many of the people we see think they do. It's how do we clear it so that it's not staying around, so you can have more balance. So there are a lot of reports, and it's really important to listen to each person to find out what their goals are, what their symptoms are, to be able to best recommend which test would give them the answers that are the most applicable to them at this stage.
I find that fascinating because I worked in dermatology as part of my GP training, spent a lot of time with patients who had debilitating eczema, and you mentioned other atopy, hay fever. I've had that myself, and it can be so horrible and really difficult to get on top of, and any kind of other allergic conditions. I never realized that you could potentially test how someone is processing their histamine for genetic reasons. And then I'm assuming that you can then, just like with all the other genetic testing, you can use that information and potentially optimize how they clear their histamine. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I saw somebody last week who had come to me and had been put on by another practitioner a DAO supplement to try and help mop up histamine at every meal. But when you looked at her genetics, which came through after she'd come to see me, actually that wasn't the pathway that was struggling. It was the detoxification side that was struggling. So she was she'd been spending quite a lot of money on the DAO supplements, but that wasn't the support she needed. And it gave us that information and allowed us to say, okay, this is what we need to support. And she was able to see that. So she, of course, was on board because she knew why.
It's incredible. It's essentially going against blanket advice that you're just kind of scattergun throwing at everyone, saying, oh, just try a low histamine diet and see how you go. A low histamine diet is miserable.
And I've had clients who've been on them for a long time, and I'm like, okay, we're going to gently stop that now. But it's about the balance and the modulation, and it's about the pathways, and what can we do to support not just the DAO pathway, but the other pathways? What we can do to support methylation? Everybody, it's like, what are we going to do that's right for you? What are we going to do that's right for you? And what are we going to focus on? Because that's what you're feeling. Not everything, because the reports are very comprehensive. And, there are bits everywhere. You keep saying, the 2 obesity genes, but they're not being expressed for you. You're aware of them. And, you might sometimes think, oh, well, maybe I don't need that second helping. But you're aware of them now, but they're not being expressed. So if you were coming to me and I was building you a nutrition set of recommendations based on your reports, I would kind of put it as a little, just be aware, maybe think, but I wouldn't go into any detail. If you'd come to me with other things that you were experiencing, the hay fever, etc., that's what I would focus on, because that's what's being expressed.
And ultimately, it means that you can offer much more efficient care. Because I think what's so frustrating for patients is if they have to keep making lifestyle changes for a protracted period of time and they're just not seeing any results. Because that's just wasted time, isn't it? And if you have really frustrating conditions like eczema, having to put up with a condition like that that's just not getting better and is feeling really uncomfortable and potentially impacting your self-esteem and all sorts of other things and making you more vulnerable to infections on your skin and all sorts of things, then it's much harder to keep up with those changes if you don't see any change.
You don't keep up. After a while, you're just like, I don't know what's working, what's not working, I give up. And that's, a lot of my work is about all of my work with Mosaic patients across the board. It's all about, this isn't just a short-term set of recommendations. Some of them might be a bit more short-term, but basically, I would like to help you eat the way that is the best for you so you feel wonderful. So it's changing, a little bit slower. And I'd rather people didn't suddenly try and do 10 recommendations all at once, implemented 1 or 2, get them in, get comfortable with them, don't think about them anymore, then the next couple, because this is the way that we want you to eat to make you feel well going forward. And having that knowledge where you can pinpoint, you can say, I know exactly where you actually do need the support, specifically in terms of what you've come to see us about, is invaluable, because A, they can see the why. Why am I asking them to do something? They've got the information, but also we're actually targeting the thing that potentially can make the most difference.
Yeah,
and that's got to be a good thing.
Okay, so we've talked about A to P, which would be really relevant for a lot of people. That's your hay fever, your eczema, your asthma. This could be really game-changing for them. My next question, which will affect a lot of people, and I'm sorry if this is a curveball, what about hormones?
Definitely. Life Code have got a lovely hormone report. I'm just going to whip it open while we're speaking. But it's got a lovely hormone report. So it looks at the steroid hormones coming from cholesterol down to your mood, progesterone, DHES to the testosterone and estrogen. So it's not just the female hormones, but the male hormones as well. It's appropriate to both. But also it looks at your cortisol pathways. So how you're processing your stress. Are you somebody who, once your stress gets going, you can't switch it off? Or are you somebody who gets that little peak? And then, yes, as so many of us are, it gets triggered on and then it won't go off. And it has a very lovely page about the estrogen life cycle, because it's a very important part of many of us. And the estrogen life cycle isn't just important in terms of the breast cancer service that we've repeatedly mentioned today, but also for people suffering from perimenopause or bad PMS. There are all kinds of life stages where hormone imbalance can have a really important impact, and knowing where you have that propensity to either have slower or faster pathways. There's a very important 3 pathways in the estrogen life cycle, which we generally call the good, the bad, and the not so pretty, normally the ugly, but I'm going to try and taper it down a bit. But, if you know that you have pathways that go faster to the ugly pathway, which I have, I'm all up regulated on that pathway. I've got good genes on the other pathways, but that ugly pathway is going to try and, get there first and take the estrogen first. That means it's really important that I down-regulate those faster genes that are there through nutrition. Things like grapefruit is an inhibitor of the gene that I have that's particularly fast. So it's not so good if I want to take some medications, because grapefruit will also inhibit that. But in terms of my estrogen, it's a good thing to have and to really support those other 2 pathways so that my estrogen will be more attracted to them and go down those.
And again, I love that it's a food first approach, that simple things like that can actually make a really big difference. And for my test, I know that I'm potentially very good at kind of creating a bottleneck of the metabolite where it just builds up too much in my system. And so making sure that I'm always doing everything on the other end to clear it out and support it is really important for me. And this might surprise people listening in. Constipation is definitely something I should be avoiding for that reason, because your estrogen, a lot of the metabolites are cleared through your bowel movements. And so if you're backed up, then it potentially allows you to accumulate too much estrogen, which for people like me could increase my risk of breast cancer. It could increase things like or symptoms related to endometriosis. So it's definitely so relevant for health in lots of different ways. Just another example of why having a high fiber diet and having really good, efficient bowel movements could have an amazing knock-on effect on your health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We want to eliminate the estrogen that's already done its bit. We don't want it to go around and be recycled because you carry on making more. So we definitely need your stool to go out regularly and to be well supported, plenty of fiber and a great gut microbiome, because that microbiome, as you know, more than anybody, is so crucial.
Absolutely. And also, again, I know I've said this before, but learning these things about yourself and learning where you might have vulnerabilities in your genetics is never going to be a bad thing, because the only tests that we do are ones that we know that we can potentially modify and do something about. So in my case, if anyone listening in, when you commented on how you process your cortisol, are you someone who, once you push your foot down on the pedal to escalate your cortisol, does it just stay there? So your cortisol keeps going up? I raise my hand because I know I'm one of those people genetically, and you are too. So I know I'm so vulnerable to chronic cortisol. And that's really relevant for me, again, because of my estrogen processing. The things that I remember Dr. Amy telling me that I needed to avoid were stress, because that could exacerbate it negatively. And this is bad news, but alcohol. And hearing someone say that to you because of your individual genes, it does make you think twice.
Definitely. It doesn't have to all be bad news. There is lots of things that we can compensate with and things that we can do a balance. I'm not one, as a nutritional therapist, I'm a pragmatist. I really don't want to say this is an all or nothing and you suddenly have to be holier than thou and you can't live a life. It's about the balance of it. You know, enjoy that glass of wine, but what can you do around it that means that you are detoxing it well, that it doesn't stay in your system? Do you choose to have a glass of wine because you're feeling really relaxed out with friends and you're having a nice evening? Well, then your cortisol is going to be less involved. So the benefits of having a lovely night out with your friends. Now, I'm not ever going to be one that's going to say, you know, let's drink lots all the time. But I'm just trying to say that, you know, all of these reports give information And it's about what you do most of the time and how you can support those systems. It's not about the one-off event that happens that suddenly it's not a black and white situation. And often things that we have, there are different approaches to it.
So we've talked about metabolic conditions. That's your heart disease, stroke, and dementia. TIPI, which was one I wasn't expecting you to mention. I didn't even realise that was a test you could perform. We know it's relevant for hormones, so that's going to have an impact on your risk of hormonal cancers, MS, perimenopause, all of those sorts of things, and gynecological conditions like endometriosis, PCOS, etc. Are there any other groups of patients you think we've missed out, who you think, oh no, I would always want to do a nutrigenomic test for you?
I think the nervous system report for somebody, the hormones report gave the page on the cortisol, adrenal, etc. And that was a really good introductory pathway to it. But the nervous system report really delved deeply into the other parts of that system to really show that accelerator versus brake pedal, and where I'm not so much cortisol, I'm the adrenaline. Once the adrenaline's on, it's the hair out of the trap. It's not going to stop. And it having that detail is where it's really useful, because instead of just saying, oh, well, it's stress, it's more than stress, and it's more an area of stress. So how can I support that so that I get more of the more soothing dopamine kind of effects, because they're a bit blunted in me. So, a little bit of an anxious type.
And it's really empowering to have that information, isn't it? Because I think, again, mental health has been massively dumbed down. And I think a lot of people are being labelled as having anxiety, when actually I sometimes find that quite an unhelpful term. And in my case, I know, like you, that my genes make me more vulnerable to overproducing cortisol. And then I also have an inefficient GABA production. If anyone listening, GABA is your nice humming neurotransmitter, and I seem to be very inefficient at producing it.
Don't have that.
Yeah, but the great news is there are things you can actually do to compensate. So you work with your biology rather than against it, and rather than just labeling yourself as, oh, I'm just an anxious type, as if it's a personality trait. Well, no, my biology means I'm vulnerable to a certain reaction, but these are the things I can do to then make sure that doesn't happen to me.
Absolutely. I mean, Life Code also does a really interesting report that I've seen a few of them, not as many as I have of the others, but I'm interested in it for things like thyroid, Hashimoto's, because they do a metals and minerals report that sees whether you have a SNP that means that you might absorb too much or too little selenium, for example, or iron, or magnesium. Whereas so you hear so much about magnesium, but do you have a propensity to needing even more, a bit like the vitamin D we talked about earlier? And I think that's so interesting. It's one I haven't done on myself because it's very recent. But I think for certain populations, such as I said, thyroid issues, I think it's a really interesting report to have.
It's fascinating. So you've listed 2 extra nutrigenomic tests that I now want to have done, because I want the metabolic one, and now I really want that one because I'm prone to very low magnesium, and I've never really been able to fully understand why I'm so vulnerable to it. So I'll put that on my Christmas wish list. That makes a huge difference. Yeah. And on that topic, my last question was, where do you see the future of nutrigenomic testing going? How do you think, in an ideal world, if it became more readily available, or more medical professionals were trained to use it, or even knew about it? Bearing in mind, I only learned about this when I became a patient. How could we potentially actually see this affecting medicine and health in general in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I think there's an increasingly loud voice for preventative healthcare. and for addressing things before they've got to the acute or chronic stage. And I think nutrigenomic testing, I really hope that it can move from being a niche private add-on, which it is at the moment, into becoming standard part of that preventative healthcare. I think it needs to be distributed and used by practitioners who have the training in it, who can do that balance between we can't address every SNP and sometimes a SNP in one pathway is positive, as we said earlier, and sometimes it's less positive in a different pathway. So what are we going to address for you? Because I think just having all of the information can be quite overwhelming, and you need somebody to be able to cut through the wood and show you the trees and say, these are the things that you need to focus on. This is what's important for you. And I think as the evidence base grows and testing becomes cheaper and faster, it's already pretty fast. And you combine it with other data like the gut microbiome that's so important. We can do, in some cases at Mosaic Medical, we do methylation tests that check what your actual present day methylation pathways are actually doing, so that you can map out what your genetics say it should be doing, is likely to be doing, and what it's actually doing, so that you can marry those two bits of information and make sure that you're having all of the support. I think having that much fuller picture of somebody's health, rather than looking at one gene in isolation, seeing the global about of it. And I'd love 10 years from now that this kind of insight would be just woven into the routine. This is what happens. This is proactive care rather than something that somebody has to seek out separately. Because I think having our own blueprint and being able to action things and feel in control of our own health and well-being is just the most important thing. And that's what I really hope to be achieving going forward.
And it's like you said, your genes don't change, and this is a test you could do for a 1-day-old baby. I mean, you wouldn't do that, and there are kind of ethical considerations. No. I think, you need to ask. Ultimately, I think with genetic testing, the individual needs to give consent.
Absolutely.
In a theoretical world, can you imagine if you, as soon as a baby was born, you did their genetic testing for them and you said, right, okay, this is what you're genetically vulnerable to in future. We need to do this, this, and this, and this, just to make sure that we're ensuring that you reduce your risk.
In terms of nutrigenomics, I'm not going to ever pronounce on somebody being genetically vulnerable to something. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that, there are some genes that are very linked to cardiovascular health, so that will be there. I think I would like to, more importantly, say, how can we help your body live its best life? Yeah. How can we? That's really what my aim is. I don't want to put a fear and a thing, I have a propensity to, it might happen to me, because so many of the genes that we have are never expressed. And it really does depend on your nutrition and your lifestyle. As you said earlier, you said it in a lovely way. I've heard it in a much harsher way about, your genes are the gun, but your environment is what, your nutrition, your environment is what loads it. And it's not as pretty as the way you described it with the cooking. That was much nicer. But I think we, just knowing that there's a susceptibility along certain pathways and that they can be supportive is a positive thing, rather than considering the more potentially negative connotations of it. I'd like to be empowering.
Yeah. Ultimately, I suppose it's bespoke medicine, really. And I love the example of mental health, actually, because that's something I hadn't thought about. But actually, if you took an individual who had lifelong anxiety or depression and you did their nutrigenomics and showed them, okay, look, you're not producing enough GABA for various reasons, or you have the propensity not to do that, and you're more vulnerable to high cortisol, and you can't absorb B12 appropriately. And look, you can't absorb magnesium very well, and you also can't absorb folate, etc., and you're vulnerable to thyroid problems. All of a sudden, you take an individual who has been branded as someone with mental health, and instead of just telling them that, you're saying, no, you genetically have all of these different interlinking issues that could culminate in certain symptoms we've described as anxiety, but let's pick apart all of those, optimize your biology, and significantly reduce your risk of that happening.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
And there is, Life Code has got a thyroid report. You've just reminded me. Another one
wonderful.
I've not done.
I want to get that one too.
So they keep popping into my mind. I'm sorry, Life Code. But yes, I think being able to unpick, I think you described it beautifully. I don't need to say anything else.
No, but it's exciting, isn't it? And it just goes to show that medicine is changing for the better, and there are lots of things for us to look forward to in the future.
Definitely.
Wonderful. On that note, thank you so much for bearing with me. I feel like I roughly understand methylation a little bit more, especially with that helpful cooking analogy. Although if you ask me tomorrow, you'll probably need to remind me. It's just such a difficult thing to wrap your head around. But I think for anyone listening in, the details almost don't matter. It's just the general concepts of realizing we're looking at aspects of your genes that we can potentially optimize and modify, and it's never going to be a bad thing to have more information.
Agreed. I think my descriptions in this short time, I think if I review them afterwards, I'm going to wish I'd said it differently. But I think, as you say, the general gist of the information is there. And I think it's an empowering thing for people to be able to have and know.
And we've both learned a lot about it from doing our own tests as well. Right, you've given me a shopping list. Thank you so much for joining me, Jess. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and I look forward to our next podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It was lovely.